Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another part of the F-Secure webinar series. I am Christine Bejarasco, and I lead the Tactical Defense Unit in F-Secure. We live in interesting times. It's not every day that we get to experience an event that is truly global, like for instance what's happening now with the COVID-19 pandemic, where almost every country, if not every country in the world, is impacted. And this pandemic managed to become one of the biggest phenomena during our time. And of course, people are naturally worried, not only about their health, but of their livelihood, of their businesses, of their investments. What will the world look like after this pandemic? What will your business look like? These are very real causes for concern. And of course, the threat actors, they know that with such a big event like this, if they manage to package the threats that they have together with relevant and timely information, and especially if that information could be specific to a certain locality, a certain geography, then they could increase the chances that their threats could be installed in the victim's device. And emails as this type of distribution mechanism is still one of the top distribution mechanisms or infection vectors that we have seen. In 2019, these are the top threats that have been distributed via email. And the 12 threats that we see here comprise 80% of the volume out of the top 20 threats that we see. So this has good representation here. For instance, you see Emotet, which is a malware distribution mechanism. And then you also see info stealers. You see remote access Trojans. You can see keyloggers and some ransomware. So there's good representation among these top 12 threats. And of course, if you want to distribute your threats via email, there better be something useful, something valuable for the user in there. Otherwise, they wouldn't even read your email, much less execute the attachment in it. Or if you have a URL inside your email, they will not click on that URL if it's not valuable for them. So these threat actors are always looking for something that could be potentially valuable to the user. And we were wondering, actually, we wonder if these emails have now shifted to using coronavirus themes. Never one to be left behind, Emotet, which was also top in the earlier slides, was one of the first that we saw to use this theme. So last January, after Japan reported about their first domestic coronavirus infection, Emotet had this email that is in Japanese and had a malicious document attachment, which has a malicious macro inside it, which when executed will install Emotet into the device. And then there's Lokibot. So Lokibot is an info stealer that is usually after your cryptocurrency wallet's credentials or the passwords that are stored in the browsers. And what Lokibot did was that after Vietnam reported about domestic coronavirus infections, it created email that, for instance, what you see here is pretending to be an invoice that was delayed because of the coronavirus infection. And it was pretending to come from Ho Chi Minh. And as COVID-19 virus started to move around the region and to different countries, so did the email themes. So for instance, this advisory coming from Philippine Overseas and Employment Administration from the Philippines was actually a travel advisory regarding coronavirus. And what REMCOS did, so REMCOS is a remote access Trojan, was use that information in the email theme. And moving now to Italy, so when the coronavirus cases in Italy escalated and started growing, what TrickBot did. So TrickBot is also an info stealer, and it's Emotet's partner in crime. So what it did was that it used Italian themes on its email so that it can push this malware also to the Italian-speaking audience. And then Formbook did something that's quite interesting because it's not unusual to have this type of emails that are supposedly coming from logistic companies. Threats have been using it all the time. But Formbook, another info stealer, it changed the theme of that slightly such that, for instance, your email coming from DHL supposedly states that your parcel has been delayed because of coronavirus issues. And before that, DHL actually issued an advisory that due to lockdown, they have had some delays when it comes to package delivery. And then there was some information around late February to early March regarding apparently some Israeli scientists having been weeks away from a coronavirus vaccine. So what Hawkeye did, Hawkeye is a keylogger, was that take that information and put it as an email theme. And during these times, information such as that could be such good news that people could potentially just click it. And then moving now to India. So there was information regarding fumigation of container freight stations. And what Agent Tesla did, so Agent Tesla, a keylogger and info stealer, was that take that information regarding a fumigation and use it as a theme for its emails. And then finally from last week, when the cases of coronavirus infections has escalated in the United States, the US Department of Health and Human Services informed that they are lacking medical equipment in order to handle the crisis. So what GeoLoader did, so GeoLoader is a malware downloader, and it pretended to be coming from the US Department of Health and Human Services and sending information that it is in need of the attached list of medical equipment, which of course is a malware. From what we have now seen, we can see that how opportunistic and how quick these threat actors are to act during this crisis and to change their methods so that they increase the chance that their malware actually gets installed on the user's device. But so far, we have only looked at emails that have attachments. What else is there? There are still emails that may only have URLs. For instance, some of those may be phishing or leading to scams. So what we did was that we looked at the statistics since January this year of coronavirus themed emails. And we looked at everything from those with malicious attachments to those that have scams or phishing. And we saw that there's a steady increase in the volume of these emails, even up to today. And we also took a look at what are the keywords inside those emails and created these maps. So for instance, coronavirus and COVID-19, there's nothing special with those. It's quite common. But thermometer, what is that? And then there's also, if you look closer, you can see some Italian keywords in there that are popping up on the list, which meant that there is most likely quite a bit of this Italian spam that is going around related to coronavirus. So looking at the past 24 hours now, what are the top subjects that we have seen? I guess on thermometer, you can see now that the interest is there because of non-contact thermometers, where you can take temperature without having to contact with the person's skin. But you can also see other topics here, such as COVID-19 relief payment coming from the government. Or for instance, well, some delays again in delivery of packages. There are some information related to advisory from the WHO or UNICEF. And then you can also see, well, more thermometers. But I've been talking only about emails so far, so there are still threats beyond emails. So beyond emails, you can even see that perhaps there are things that are happening within websites. So for instance, when you manage to search in Google, And then, for example, these container fried stations that are actually being fumigated. Apparently, it's interesting to some people as well. And if you search Google for those, you could end up in a website such as this, which if you click on it and enter on the website, then you could end up in a roulette that could potentially end up with, let's say, this threat, or for instance, this potentially unwanted software. Or you could see the scam that came out earlier. And one more thing that is actually quite interesting are what's happening out there? What other trends that are happening? So, for instance, from Google, you can see that the top things that are being searched on are, for example, related to hand sanitizers, or for example, related to masks. Then it's not unusual that people are actually searching for these things because, well, they're in shortage, they're in short supply. So it's not unusual that people would say that, okay, how do I make my own homemade hand sanitizer, for instance? And then they could end up potentially in a website that could have a scam or a potentially unwanted application. And then finally, one thing that we also noticed was that traffic exchange is one of those things that was distributing malware as well. So for instance, if you see here Wise Cleaner. Wise Cleaner is actually a legitimate software that is used for Windows optimizations. But in here, if you see this website, the Wise Cleaner is actually masquerading as that legitimate application. And if you see here on the right, you will see that this is being accessed by the HeatLeap application. And HeatLeap is a traffic exchange application. And when this malware is downloaded, because it is a downloader, it will try to access these different sites. And although file 3 to file 7 here during the time of analysis didn't really work out for us, the first one, for instance, is a KPOT info stealer, so one info stealer. And the second one is something that claims to be a coronavirus ransomware, which is pretty interesting. But all these threats that we see nowadays, they are trying to capitalize on this situation, on like what we're having out there. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we spot, for example, what does a malicious email look like? So from these emails, these are examples that I have shown earlier. And if you can see here, I hope you can see, these attachments are actually different archive types. Not your typical archive type, but if you can see, it's like gzip and there's ACE. Malware does this because typically your email gateways, they try to strip out if there's an attached executable on your email. And for example, even if you have a zip that has an executable inside, there's many email gateways that are able still to extract that and figure out if there's an executable inside. So what the threat actors do is use these obscure or different types of archiving mechanisms. But when you open them, they do have executables inside. So let's not open emails that look like this, because most likely there are threats inside of those. There are still also other types of attachments that are in emails. And for example, this one is the copy of the Emotet email. And if you can see, it has a document attachment. And of course, you shouldn't open this type of attachments, but just in case you manage to open it, inside could be something that looks like this. And since it's a document, it can really look like anything, but typically what they do nowadays is they have a picture that gives you instructions on what you should do, which is typically to enable editing. They do this because your Office application by default does not enable macros to execute. And the malicious code for Emotet is inside a macro. So when you enable editing, the macro executes, Emotet gets installed on your device. And then finally, when it comes to the search engine results, whatever legitimate website that you have already used before. Trust those rather than these new websites that are popping up. So please scrutinize those websites so that you actually get information that is current and relevant and coming from legitimate sources. As a summary, how do we stay safe online during these times? So let's stick to legitimate sources. Sources of information that we had a while back before this pandemic happened is sufficient already for giving us information regarding the current times. So stick to those and don't find those new websites that may not be any good and may only be dangerous towards you. And then secondly, authenticate the source of your emails, for instance. Now, what I mean by this is that two things. So if you get an email coming from an external party and it's related to coronavirus, I would even advise not to open it. But if you suspect, for instance, that it comes from your customers, come from your partners, try another way to authenticate and verify from your partners that they have sent an email. So you can do this via SMS, or you can ask the customer support from their organization, and you can verify that, okay, this was a legitimate email coming from them. And even for internal emails from within your organization, for example, especially if it has attachments or links in it, verify with the sender that they have really sent this email. So for instance, if you have their phone number, and perhaps you do because you are under one organization, then you can ask them regarding this email from an SMS. And if they confirm that they sent it, then that's okay, no harm done. But if they said that they didn't send it, then you could potentially have dodged a potential security risk to your organization. One more thing is to scrutinize the content, because as mentioned earlier, if you saw that content from the archives, they are quite unusual. They are not the typical things that you receive normally. So if those are unusual things and there's something off with them, don't click on them, don't open them. And then finally, now that many of us globally are working remotely from home, let us separate our work devices from our home devices. A work device that is at home is not a home device. That work device is an entry point towards your organization. So let's keep that work device as an extension of your office. That's all the time we have for this one for now. Once again, I'm Christine Bejerasco from the Tactical Defense Unit in F-Secure, and I'm now ready to take in your questions. All right, so we have some questions here. Let me see. Somebody has been asking about uncommon archive types. We actually have quite a long list. Well, there's GZ, there's UUE, there's ACE. I wonder if we can get back to Robert and give him a list. Is there a way to do that? Perhaps we should give it to you maybe a little bit later. I can think of 20 of those actually that we have on the list. Okay, there's something about... a question about, you talked about social engineering aspect quite a lot, in addition to training the employees to resist the attacks. Are there technical means to decrease the risk of email attacks? Sure there is. So for instance, when we are talking about these email attachments now, having in your gateway some sort of filter related to what are the file types that you allow to come inside your organization from externals, that could already help. So I think what we can do here is after this webinar, we can publish a blog of what are these top archive types that we have seen that are being used by prevalent threats that are being spread by emails right now. And then whoever is listening, you can use that list at your discretion, of course, or in order to understand what also is getting into your organization. And you can use that list to filter those content that are being used by this type of threats. All right, what else do we have here? There's a question about how the current email threats compare to the threats in the past. For example, I lost that question. Where did I go? Okay, I'll try to paraphrase the question. So comparing the threats today versus the threats in the past, they're a bit different. For example, the threats in the past, they are having attachments as well. But the threats that have, our systems have evolved in order to address those type of threats. So for instance, the attachments has also changed nowadays. So for instance, if we have executables then today they try to create documents that are most likely unfiltered at the gateway, because if you get this type of documents, then like at the end of the day, you don't want to filter those out. For example, they could be something that is sent to your finance department. But what's the same actually? This is a pretty good question because a lot of these things are more of the same than different. Because even if they have morphed a little bit in changing file types, for example, if we're talking about phishing is still a URL or like even a file that has a URL inside that is sent to your organization. You still have to click on it and it opens a browser and then you input stuff there. So there's still a lot of these email threats that are actually the same, even though some parts of it have been tweaked and changed because of the security changes also happening in the gateways. Okay, our techier employees are well aware of email scams. And phishing, and how do we get our lesser tech-savvy folk to speed up on recognizing malicious emails? I think the best way to get our people to recognize what is malicious is to first look, is there an attachment? Is there a URL? Like that's really the first, that should be the first step of suspicion. Now, if there is an attachment, that is when they start asking like, am I expecting something coming from this person? And if there is a link, is this external to my organization? Is this relevant to my organization? So with that suspicion, that should be the first step in recognizing that, wait a minute, there is something here that I need to think about before I start opening this or before I start clicking this link. What else do we have here? So there's one question. Hi, Christine. Thanks for the presentation. Thank you, Alberto. What do you think an IT security resource can do to protect his organization? Would you suggest, for example, having some VMs with EDRs, EPPs in place and opening those suspicious emails on those internal VMs? I like the idea, definitely. So one thing, this is actually like a very good input, because one thing that we typically do, for instance, for recruitment, HR during recruitment will get CVs. And CVs can be PDFs, for instance. And PDFs, well, it can be used to execute threats. So we have seen threats actually that also have PDFs in them. Now, what do you do with those things? Do you open a PDF on your own machine, which is like a surefire way to get infected? Or do you get those services which actually enable you to open the PDF in the cloud, in a different machine that is intended to open these files somewhere else? That is definitely very helpful in order to avoid this type of issues. Now, he was talking as well, Alberto was as well talking about EDRs and EPPs. At the very least, when it comes to EPPs, it's basic hygiene to put an EPP on the device, because it gathers and detects the threats that are really are at the last level and intending to execute something on the device. And EDRs, they are better served when you don't put them in isolated environments. They are better to get telemetry when they are distributed all throughout your network, because you can get the different events from the different areas of your network, and then that can be pulled together, and then you can turn that into sort of a compiled event or an incident that somebody can respond to and somebody can understand. For example, your IT security department or an organization that offers managed detection and response. Let's see, do we still have some time? You mentioned keeping personal and corporate devices separate. How do we enforce that? Enforcing might be harder. We actually, like, you can enforce if you want to. So you can use software, for instance, that limit what type of websites your employees would visit to. So these are not very popular, these applications, but you can, for instance, say that, okay, you cannot access streaming services. And then those type of software will filter based on content classification. But if, like, a very simple thing that even without this enforcement, a very simple thing that users can do is that if you have a home laptop and a work laptop, whenever you need to install something interesting, like for personal purposes, don't do that in the work laptop, do that in the home laptop. And going back to enforcing, it could also be that whenever a user tries to install an application that is not allowed by the IT department, this could also send information towards the IT security or somebody from IT who's watching telemetry coming from the device. There's a question here. Do F-Security analysts also see phone scams rising to take advantage of COVID-19? For example, targeting older people to pay for fake urgent medical care for an infected family member. We actually haven't seen phone scams and COVID-19, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is. But of course, we have seen different types of phone scams, and like even for me, I have received some of those, but so far not COVID-19 related. I believe that's all the questions that we have in here. So thank you so much for spending the time with me today. Thank you so much for joining me in this webinar. And do remember to stay safe, both online and offline.